It's good to be here, and I do love church vitalization. It's something that I started researching on church vitalization in probably about 15 years ago, and we've done several books and research projects on the topic. What I want to share with you is not actually directly from that. I'm just, what kind of following. We have a great leader here, David, and this is David's book, by the way, Reconnect Your Church. And so he asked me to kind of bring these themes. And so the second session that I bring to you will be more church vitalization oriented. But this is a big issue that churches wanting to engage in revitalization have to address. And that's, how do we do it in an increasingly hostile world? And of course, the challenge is this is difficult in different ways in different places. But what we all sort of know, what we kind of probably have a common agreement towards, is that there is sometimes a headwind. There are headwinds that we're experiencing in church and in culture and in issues like revitalization. Now, there are places where that's not the case. If we were in, Brazil today, I think we would say that this is a very receptive and responsive time. So a lot depends upon where you are and how that responsiveness actually goes. In the West, and we do see, and by West I would include all the way from Eastern Europe all the way across to the Americas. In the West, we see and we feel a sense that there's a growing discomfort with what Christians believe, and furthermore, there's increasing pushback about what they practice. And the way sometimes I like to phrase it in its simplest is we've lost our home field advantage. We've lost our home field advantage. And part of that has to do with the rise of secularism. Part of that has to do with the rise of new ideologies that are sort of pushed back against traditional Christian morals and values. And the perception that Christians, and there's definitely not, when we use the word Christian, we recognize all kinds of people use the word Christian in different ways, but there are sorts and sets of Christians who hold views that are now outside of the mainstream of culture in ways that perhaps weren't 30, 40, 50 years ago. So we're in a real season of shaking, and I want to kind of talk through some of what that season of shaking looks like, and we'll unpack this here. Now, I just was in England, where I teach twice a year there in England, and I was just teaching through some of this last week in class, and had some students from different parts of Europe that were there, and we kind of found a continual theme, right? So that we are certainly in a season and a time of shaking, and that shaking that we feel has kind of caught many of our attention. It's political, it's geographical, related to war, and people, and we were having conversations about war in Europe that we wouldn't have been having just 3 years ago. In fact, it seems that ever since 2020, the world has accelerated in its pace of change, and we feel the shaking going on all around us. Now, you don't know me, but in my work in the U.S., primarily, and some in Canada and the U.K., is that most people would see me as a kind of tempered voice. When some people say the sky is falling, all these Christians are dropping out of church, I actually don't think the statistics always point to the same reality that sometimes people are shouting from the rooftops. But the reality is that I think that the years we're in right now are unlike anything we have been in our lifetime. And sometimes we talk about the pandemic, right? So I put a picture here so you'll see remember those days. We don't like those days. Let's not look at those days. But what you see is that really we're going through a series of pandemics. And the word pandemic in English is used for more than just sickness. You might say there's a pandemic of mental health issues, or there's a pandemic of gambling, or there's different things that people would say, a pandemic of pornography. All things which we would say, and all things which are true. But we also see, and let me mention to you that I recognize that some of you English is a second, third, or fourth language. So when I present something, I'll often tell you that I've written an article on this. So I've written an article on this. I'm the editor of a magazine called Outreach Magazine. So if you just Google my name, Ed Stetzer Pandemics or 5 Pandemics, this article would come up and you could follow along with it. Not the outline I'm doing here, but some of the things that will come from there. So there's a pandemic of distrust in culture. We're in the West, we've kind of come to the place that in Europe, United States, other places, and around the world as well, where people just increasingly distrust one another. And that's led to a higher level of distrust in towards people in the church, towards pastors, we might call clergy. Now, let me say that when sometimes people put out statistics and say the trust in clergy is really declining, well, the trust in everybody's really declining right now. So the trust in bankers and politicians and everybody else is declining. So we see that across Europe and is a decline in trust, and that causes people to look at other places, other people, and say maybe we need new leaders. Maybe we need to throw out the whole group of old leaders and just go with a whole new direction. So you sort of feel that. There's also a pandemic of damage from technology. The damage from technology. By this, I don't mean like AI, though that certainly can be. I'm very involved in some AI work, and AI certainly is it's both a wonderful superpower that I would encourage you to use, and something that could kill us all. So there's both of those things. So you decide how best to walk through that. But what I'm talking about here is that you're all one Telegram post away from a crisis meeting in your church or your organization. Because somebody can say anything, and they do. They can say anything they want, and you have to sit down and say, well, how are we going to respond to this? The world has become flat, so anybody can say anything, and there's no way for some people to be able to determine whether it's true or whether it's legitimate. So that pandemic of damage from technology is very real. We feel it, and sometimes we live in concern of it. There's number 3 is a disorientation in identity. And maybe when I say identity, you think of gender identity, and that certainly would be part of the conversation. But if you look at the schedule here, the schedule at the European Leadership Forum, you'll actually see more than one conversation about gender identity, which, again, 5 years ago, we probably weren't having a lot of those conversations. Now, if you're a youth pastor in a church, you've probably had a session and talked about this with the influence of social media and some from the West and more. In the U.S., it's become a real defining issue of how Christians, again, are on the outside of mainstream culture. The culture would say we're on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of the cultural divide. And I do mean that, but what does it mean to be, what's the identity of being a European? What's the identity of being Hungarian? When I say that, some of you are thinking that, okay, that makes sense. What's the identity? What does it mean to be French? What does it mean to hold these identities in a world of mass migration and immigration? What does it mean when we're questioning religious identities? What do these things mean? Because right now is a real disruption of that. People are really asking disorientation of that. People are really asking, who am I? So yes, that includes some people asking with gender and gender dysphoria and transgenderism, again, which there are other sessions about that here. But I think people are asking that as well. One of the things we see in the United States is that people of color, people who are African Americans, probably and Latino are the largest group in our context, who are part of minority communities. They're asking, do I really want to be a part of a church that is not reflective of my culture, not answering the questions that my culture is answering? So we feel this. Now, when I describe these things, I'm just describing them. I'm not telling us what we should do. I'm going to give some of that, but I want you not to get all riled up or anxious but I'm saying these are things we should embrace. Now, these are current cultural challenges, pandemics in our culture that people are unsure how to respond to. A disruption to mental health we've seen across the developed world. People asking questions about, what does this mean, this growing level of suicide and suicidal ideation? What does that mean? People thinking about suicide. We might see that, for example, I have 3 daughters. My daughters are 19, 22, and 25. And I have seen in their friends how negatively they have been impacted by social media as teenage girls. I mean, just their mental health has been deeply impacted. We sort of kept our kids away from social media, tried to convince them it wasn't great. And in most cases it worked. But to see how that mental health has been disrupted, we see all around us people unsure how to address the mental health crisis. And I don't know as much here But I can tell you in the U.S. it's led to some significant division in churches. Significant division in churches, how to address some of these things. Like I said, I just came from the U.K. for a few weeks, and that's there as well, where people are unsure how to, when the pressure comes down on Christians, it presses down on Christians, they tend to either turn to one another, we're in this together, or sometimes they turn on one another. And I think some of that's taking place in the U.S. and the U.K. and some other places as well. The Philippines and Brazil, we see it, feel that in other places as well. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about those pandemics in culture. We're experiencing some cultural difficult times, but I'm really going to focus on three things. I know there's a slide on the board. But the first thing I'm going to focus on is our current cultural convulsion. Right? I mean, I've sort of hinted that these are parts of that cultural convulsion, right? These pandemics, but our current cultural convulsion. Now, I first began to write on this a few years ago, in around 2020. There was a author in the United States who wrote an article named Stephen Brooks, and he wrote an article called "America's Going Through a Moral Convulsion." So I found it was a good article, but one of the things I was seeing and hearing was it wasn't just America. It was around the world. People were experiencing just ways of thinking, old ideas resurging, new ideas being pushed down. We're in the midst of a cultural convulsion. So I wrote an article. You're just, you can look up my name, Google my name, and cultural convulsion. You'll find the article. And what I said is that we're in a unique time of cultural convulsion. And cultural convulsions, I mean, they tend to happen, and they tend to happen sometimes in cycles. Not always, but sometimes they happen in cycles. And they sort of, there's a lot of division, and then maybe it settles down for a few decades, and a lot of division, and settles down for a few decades. And so we seem to be in one of those cultural convulsions now. And I don't know all the national ideological struggles in each nation represented in this room, but what we hear from observers around the world is that it's tenser than it's been before, it's more divided than it's been before, new alliances are emerging, old alliances are fading, and I think a lot of that has to do with the cultural division that's there. But also, I think there is something also going on. When there's a cultural convulsion, sometimes there's an accompanying cultural acceleration. Things are shaken up, and then they start moving faster. Things are shaken up, and then they start moving faster. And we've seen this cultural convulsion just in the hallway. So the UK leaders were talking about the acceleration on same-sex marriage and homosexuality in the Church of England. They were just talking about that in the hallway. And I was teaching at a Church of England institution, and they certainly feel that there was kind of an agreement for, long Church of England, goes back centuries, and everyone's kind of on the same page. And then there's an acceleration that a group of people change their mind, and then a bunch of other people rapidly change their mind with them. So that's cultural acceleration. And we're seeing a cultural acceleration where across much of Europe on same-sex marriage, where kind of key elite leaders change their mind, and then the culture of the media starts portraying the change of mind. This is what it looks like when our minds change. And then culture itself begins to move that direction. And in most places, we see that acceleration over the last few years. And it's also the acceleration around transgenderism. We have seen, for example, that that's only 5 years. 5 years ago, we weren't discussing these things much in churches. Today, we have to, we should talk about these things in churches. Where I live in California, you're a teacher, you could lose your job if you don't use the pronouns selected by the students. So teachers are struggling. How do we address this? We talk about this at church. 10 years ago, we would have talked about this at church. Now we would have a sermon. How do you navigate these cultural realities? So our cultural convulsion is very real. And it's worth noting that cultural convulsions are hard on Christians, but also sometimes produce more Christians. Let me say it again. Sometimes hard on Christians, but they also produce more Christians. We're in the Church Revitalization Network here. So we're looking at, in this Church Revitalization Network, a series of David left me that little card, and now I don't see that little card, but I think he took it back. So the little card that sort of explained gathered and scattered. You don't have that. So thank you. But David has this healthy church paradigm centered on the gospel, where Christians learn to love God, to love others. But then on the side, it's within its cultural context. So my assignment here is to help us to see that the cultural context has shifted. But this is key. Because when it comes to church revitalization, you have to take into account the water in which you swim, the context in which you seek to engage. And that context has become convulsed and in some ways increasingly skeptical of the church. So the culture has become convulsed and in some ways increasingly skeptical of the church. So people who are the scattered church, remember David's paradigm, gathered and scattered. Good paradigm, but paradigm that we all love. So the people in the scattered church need to be equipped when they're in the gathered church to face an increasingly hostile world. So sometimes there's a temptation to say, well, we won't talk about these things in church, yet then they go to their schools and they hear about these things on a regular basis. All right, so number 1 of 3 is our cultural convulsion. Number 2 is the great sort. This is the great sort. This is what I want to explain is there's a sense that in culture today, people are sorting themselves away from one another and into deeper relationship with some people while less relationship with other people. And a lot of that has to do with this technology, right? So you can have a whole community of people find online in your different, Facebook group or your Telegram channel or whatever else it may be. And it does sort people. And one way it's sorted people, what we're finding in the United States, more so in the United States and Canada, a little less so in the UK. And I'd have to have some of you comment on, I'm going to ask you to have some of this conversation in just a few minutes, is that people are sorting themselves ideologically into and out of their churches. So, for example, we have churches in the United States that you would consider solid, Bible-believing, preaches verse by verse through the Bible, inerrantist believing, and people have left those churches mad because they haven't been as engaged in what we call the culture war in the United States. We need you to preach against this politician or this leader, and we need you to preach for this politician and this leader. And so they've left their churches. Sometimes 5-10% of people have left to say, I want to go to a church that's more vocal. And some people left the other way. Some of their churches less vocal. So we find that people are sorting themselves ideologically. And we see this in France, with the rise of, new parties, new ideologies that often are connected online. We see this in Germany. We see this all around in Hungary, Europe. We see this all around Europe as well. Though it may impact the churches less. But you can tell me in just a few minutes. But I think it's worth noting here that technology really, really, really makes a big difference. And I know this looks like a strange piece of technology, but this piece of technology is 2,000 years old. It's 2,000 years old. And it is the Romans discovered / created a metal that they could fold and mold. Technically, word is it's malleable. So this is a metal that they folded and rolled up, you get the top of it, into a pipe. So this is a 2,000-year-old Roman pipe that changed everything in Rome. Because now the villas of the rich would have hot and cold running water. 2,000 years ago, hot and cold running water. They would have, and all of this made possible. They loved this metal because they would keep it in its shape. They would fold it and mold it into goblets, cups and plates. So they eat off of it, they drink off of it, they bring the water that they drank and that they bathed in it. And so it was a game changer for 2,000 years ago Roman technology. The only problem is this technology, this is actually called lead. So lead is not a good thing to eat from. It's not a good thing to drink from. So the technology was feeding them and killing them at the same time. And I think it's wonderful. Again, we can hold up our phones. I think it's wonderful, all the things that we can do, right? I could press a button and I pressed the button and I looked and said, what's coming up? I go by a forum of Christian leaders and I know my schedule for today, right? I know who's here. I know you from this. So that's amazing. But also it has caused people to, rather than have face-to-face interaction, it has actually caused people to withdraw into enclaves, smaller groups of people who think like them, which becomes a challenge when our desire is to reach out to a world that is probably electronically connected to other places and is less connected to their neighbor next door, who our desire is to show the love of Jesus to. So when we look at these realities, I want you to see that there's opportunity and challenge that's here. Okay, remember, I'm almost exclusively focusing on this session on the within its cultural context from David's paradigm here, and the scattered church who's living out in lists as family, local community, place of work or study, leisure time and friends, right? That's the church on mission, and the mission field matters. Let me say this again. Let me say it twice. The how of mission is in many ways determined by the who, when, and where of culture. The how of mission is in many ways determined by the who, when, and where of culture. So when you think about a time, maybe like it is right now in Brazil, where people are moving away from their nominal connection to Catholicism, they're very attracted to the idea that Jesus offers new life and a new way of living. Even on David's chart, it says attractional and missional. Great. You could be an attraction church in Brazil and be revitalized because the cultural winds are blowing your way, right? The cultural winds are not blowing our way. And that's what David wanted me to kind of articulate today. It doesn't mean you can't lead a revitalized church, but in most of Europe, the cultural winds are not blowing our way. So let's talk some about that. Headwinds and tailwinds might help us. So I flew here last night. I'm a little tired. Shouldn't be, because I've been in Europe for 2 weeks, but here I am. So flew here last night. And maybe a better example was when I flew from the US to the UK. I live in Los Angeles now. I'm the dean of a Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. So I flew from Los Angeles to Heathrow Airport. And it took me, depending upon the flight, it takes somewhere between 10 and a half and 11 and a half hours. Now, how is it that it takes between 10 and a half and 11 and a half hours? Like if they got the same speed, they fly at the same speed, well, the answer is, of course, headwinds. So when you have strong headwinds, you get there later because it slows you down. So I think we have substantive headwinds in Europe, the US, Canada. We have substantive headwinds that are kind of worth us thinking about and how we're going to address them as we think about the culture or where we are going to do revitalization. The first is shrinking nominalism. Shrinking nominalism. The idea here is that there are less people today. Most of the people who come to Christ in Europe and North America come to Christ after already calling themselves Christians. I'm not saying that they are, but because there's a nominal Christian commitment that's pretty widespread, most of the people who come to Christ in the West said they were a Christian before, realized that they weren't a Christian, and then, as we would describe, they are born again by grace and through faith. Okay. So now the challenge is that shrinks regularly. Like in Germany, for example, every year there's a little fewer people who identify as Christian. I mean, even culturally Christian. So as nominalism shrinks, a ready pool of evangelistically open people shrinks. So it's much harder to see come to Christ a Muslim. It's much harder to see come to Christ an atheist, an avowed atheist. It's much harder to see come to Christ a Hindu, because they already see themselves as distant from Christianity. So I grew up outside of New York City, and I was Irish. I was in an Irish Catholic family, but we didn't go to church. The Catholic Church was the church we didn't go to. But one day, somebody explained to me, I already knew there was a God, I just didn't think I could know him. I knew he had a book, I just didn't think I could understand it. So I already knew those things. And most people in Europe who use the word Christian to describe themselves already know there's a God, they just don't think they could have a personal relationship with him. They probably know he wrote a book, they just don't think it means much to them. Those are the most receptive, responsive people probably to the gospel. Yet there's less of them every year. Nominalism, name only. So Lausanne, we recently had a gathering in Italy, in Rome, talk about the great challenge of nominalism in the West. So we see and feel that there. So cultural headwinds include shrinking nominalism, the attitude towards proselytizing, evangelism, right? But the attitude towards trying to get people to switch their religion. Sometimes when you have a strong Orthodox presence, you may feel that, or a strong Catholic presence. It's sort of like, it's okay if you believe those things, just don't try to get somebody else to change what they believe. Yet, we know that Jesus said to us, go therefore make disciples of all nations. In John 20:21, he said, as the Father has sent me, even so send I you. So David kind of reminds us in this chart that that's part of the sending. We are sent, right? We are sent on mission as a church on mission. That's not always appreciated by a lot of people today. Another is accelerated cultural shifts, particularly when those cultural shifts where Christians have what are perceived to be anti-women views, anti-LGBT views. Now, again, it depends upon your country here in Europe today, but it's a very different conversation in France than it is in Hungary. But the reality is the cultural trends are going towards broader acceptance of those things. While Christians, and we can see that on the schedule. If you just open your phone app, you can see how many sessions there are. Accelerating cultural shifts cause people to think Christians are bigoted and small-minded. And then sometimes, depending on your country, the image of evangelicalism depends upon your country. Certainly in the UK, we see and feel that. Sometimes that's the image of American evangelicalism, that if you use the word evangelical, if people know what that word means in America, I apologize that we have not done well preserving what that word means in that context. Okay, so there are certainly cultural headwinds, right? But there are also some cultural tailwinds. So tailwinds are the things that accelerate gospel share, gospel openness. And I got to tell you, we see a lot of that as well. Let me share a few. And so some of them include like a spiritual hunger. One of the things that we have seen and learned is that, well, it also kind of relates to the second thing, is it's just not working. Like all this stuff that was supposed to get better every year, like started in the early 2000s, and it was like, again, there was this almost a sense of optimism. We're going to make the world a better place, and it's just not. I mean, over and over again, what we're seeing is that the modern idea of inevitability of progress, people are just sort of giving up on. I mean, again, I mentioned the war in Europe, and we're all just waiting for the war to start in Asia, and so you see all these things. And how do you respond to all that? Well, for a lot of people in the world, they have a spiritual hunger. The modern promises that technology and civilization are going to make it all better every year are just failing. And so they're going to turn to something. And sometimes they turn to really harmful ideologies. That's why we see the rise of some really harmful ideologies that we thought were dead and gone. Sometimes they'll turn to other faiths and other religions. We see a lot of young men turning to Islam. Why? Because they see the world kind of disintegrating around them, and to them Islam offers a promise of something sure and steady. So you see that these things together create a gospel opportunity. Also, too, I think if Christians can, in this time, be focused on deploying people for mission, the very kind of things that David's teaching us and talking to us about here in Reconnect Your Church, if we can be deployed for mission, then that's a tailwind. There's people right now, when the world's gotten a bit of a mess, maybe after COVID, a lot of churches, more people said, I want to serve, I want to share the gospel. So there's a sense that there's an openness to that. But I do think that one of the tailwinds is that tumult leads to opportunity. There are, in the West, most people would point back to 1968 as the time when the West was as convulsed as it is today. And that's also a fascinating time when you think what happened with the global spread of the gospel. There was this 5-year just lurch forward. The Jesus People movement began in the United States. But you hear the same thing of what happens in the UK. You can hear similar things of what happened in church planting other places. When the world gets frustrated, angry, and tired, the gospel often advances. We can also see that. We can see, you go back to Pentecostalism. I don't know how many Pentecostals we have at the European Leadership Forum. Anybody a Pentecostal here? Raise both hands, brother. Raise both hands. There you go. There you go. So if you go back to Pentecostalism, it begins in the late 1800s, early 1900s. in the midst of a cultural convulsion. So we see this ongoing pattern where people sort of experience that gospel openness during those tailwinds. I think that the Lord has brought us to this is a verse, obviously, in a very specific situation, a very specific person in mind. But I believe in the sovereignty of God. I believe the Lord is not surprised by the current cultural moment we're in, and I believe that the moment we are in does not pause the mission we are on.